In the bustling studio of one of America's most-watched talk shows, a moment was about to unfold that would leave audiences across the nation speechless. Comment where you're watching from today, as we dive into an encounter that perfectly captures how genuine wisdom can triumph over attempted public humiliation. The studio lights cast a warm glow across the set where Thomas Manning, one of television's most aggressive interviewers, sat ready for his next guest. Known for his biting commentary and ability to make even seasoned politicians squirm, Manning had earned a reputation for creating viral moments of embarrassment. His target today? J.D. Vance, whose journey from a challenging upbringing in the Rust Belt to Yale Law School had captured America's attention. The atmosphere in the studio was charged with anticipation. The audience, including prominent figures like Michael Stewart and Jennifer Patterson in the front row, waited eagerly for what they expected would be another signature Manning takedown. Among them sat Laura Turner, a veteran journalist who had seen countless interviews go south, but something about this one felt different. As J.D. Vance walked onto the set, his demeanor was notably calm, almost serene. Unlike many guests who arrived with stacks of notes and nervous energy, Vance carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. The studio audience, including skeptics like William Parker and Sarah Morgan, watched intently as he took his seat across from Manning. Manning's opening salvo came quickly, his voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "So, Mr. Vance, you've positioned yourself as a voice for working-class Americans, yet you've attended Yale Law School and now move in elite circles. Some might call that hypocrisy. How do you explain profiting from the very story you claim to represent?" The question hung in the air, and the audience held their breath. Catherine Barnes, seated in the third row, leaned forward, expecting to see another guest crumble under Manning's practiced pressure. But what happened next would reshape the entire dynamic of the interview. Vance's response came with a measured calm that seemed to fill the entire studio. His voice carried no defensiveness, no anger, just clarity. "You know, Thomas, that's an interesting perspective. But it assumes success and authenticity can't coexist. Would you prefer that someone from a challenging background never succeed? Never get an education? Never try to make a difference?" Manning, slightly thrown by the composed response, pressed harder. "But surely you must admit you've left those roots behind. You're now part of the very establishment you criticize." He gestured to Rebecca Shannon, a prominent social critic in the audience, as if seeking backup for his assertion. The tension in the studio rose as Vance leaned forward slightly, his eyes focused not just on Manning but on the larger truth he was about to share. "Let me tell you about something that happened just last week. I was visiting my old neighborhood, talking to families still struggling with the same challenges I faced. A young woman, much like my mother was, asked me how she could help her kids believe in a better future. That's why I share my story, not to profit, but to show that your starting point doesn't have to be your ending point." The audience, including skeptics like Daniel Pierce and Rachel Brown, began to shift in their seats. Manning's usual tactics of intimidation and mockery were failing to land their usual blows. Instead, each attempt seemed to reveal more about the interviewer's own prejudices than his guest's supposed contradictions. As the first segment progressed, Manning's frustration became increasingly evident. He shuffled his notes, searching for another angle of attack. "Your critics, including respected voices like Dr. Sarah Martinez and Professor William Elliott, suggest your success story is an exception that proves the rule. That you're essentially pulling up the ladder behind you by supporting policies that make it harder for others to follow your path." What happened next would become one of the most shared clips of the year. Vance smiled, not with arrogance but with genuine warmth. "Thomas, I have to ask, have you ever spent time in communities like the one I grew up in? Not just reporting but really living there? Because if you had, you'd understand that these aren't just policy debates for us. They're about real lives, real struggles, and real solutions." The studio fell silent. Even Manning's usual quick retorts failed him as the weight of Vance's authentic experience stood in stark contrast to the interviewer's theoretical critiques. In the audience, Michelle Schmidt and Robert Lopez exchanged knowing glances. They had come expecting entertainment but were witnessing something far more powerful, the triumph of lived truth over rehearsed rhetoric. The first commercial break approached, but the dynamic had already shifted irrevocably. Manning's attempts to paint Vance as an opportunistic hypocrite had instead revealed something else entirely, a man whose success hadn't separated him from his roots but had given him a platform to advocate for them more effectively. As the cameras prepared to cut away, Vance delivered a line that would resonate far beyond the studio walls. "The greatest privilege I've gained isn't the degrees or the success, it's the ability to speak for those who still struggle to be heard. And that's a responsibility I take very seriously." The segment ended with Manning visibly reassessing his approach, while figures like Angela Brown and Justin Gallagher in the audience began whispering among themselves. The attempted takedown had backfired, and what was meant to be a moment of humiliation had transformed into a powerful demonstration of authentic leadership. In the green room, producers Melissa Strong and Christopher Parsons hurriedly discussed how to handle the remaining segments. They had expected fireworks but instead had witnessed something far more compelling: the quiet strength of genuine experience triumphing over calculated provocation. The story was far from over, but one thing was already clear: this interview would not follow the usual script of public humiliation. Instead, it was becoming a masterclass in how to maintain dignity and truth in the face of attempted ridicule. As the commercial break continued, social media was already buzzing with clips from the exchange, and the narrative was rapidly shifting from expected entertainment to unexpected wisdom. As the show returned from commercial break, the studio atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Thomas Manning, usually so confident in his role as the intellectual inquisitor, found himself in unfamiliar territory. The presence of media veterans like Charles Scott and Rachel Martin in the audience only heightened the sense that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Manning attempted to regain control of the narrative, shuffling his notes with practiced precision. "Let's talk about your recent comments on education reform, Mr. Vance. Critics like Dr. Louise Marsh and Professor N. Walker suggest your views actually harm the very communities you claim to represent." But Vance's response would once again demonstrate why authentic experience trumps rehearsed criticism. "You know, I recently spoke with David Montez, a high school teacher in my old neighborhood. He told me something fascinating about how theoretical solutions often miss the practical realities of classroom life. Would you like to hear what he shared?" The direct invitation to engage with real-world experience caught Manning off guard. In the audience, Maria Ochoa and Deborah Henry exchanged knowing looks. They had seen this dynamic before, where coastal elite perspectives collided with ground-level realities. Manning, growing increasingly frustrated, tried to interrupt with statistics and expert opinions, but Vance continued with measured calm. "These numbers you're citing, they're important, certainly. But let me tell you about Nicole Henderson, a single mother I met last month who's working 3 jobs to put her kids through school. Her story tells us more about the real impact of these policies than any spreadsheet could." The studio lights seemed to grow warmer as Vance connected each policy discussion to real human experiences. Matthew Rubio, a noted economist in the audience, found himself nodding despite his initial skepticism. This wasn't the theoretical debate he had expected, it was something far more compelling. Manning, attempting to regain the upper hand, turned to a more personal attack. "Your critics, including Ryan Jennings and Timothy Cunningham, suggest you've essentially created a carefully crafted persona. That your success story is more marketing than substance." The moment Manning finished his statement, even his loyal supporters like Colin Davis and William Parker could sense he had miscalculated. Vance's response would become one of the most quoted moments of the entire interview. "You know what's interesting about that criticism?" Vance began, his voice carrying the weight of authentic experience. "It assumes that success somehow invalidates struggle, that you can't understand poverty once you've escaped it. But ask yourself, who better to speak about climbing a mountain than someone who's made the climb?" In the audience, Stacey Rogers and Nicole Smith sat stunned. They had come expecting another predictable political takedown, but instead were witnessing a masterclass in turning hostile questioning into meaningful dialogue. Manning's frustration became increasingly evident as he turned to more aggressive tactics. Joshua Stone suggests your narrative conveniently ignores systemic issues. That you're essentially promoting a pull-yourself-up-by-your-bootstraps mythology that's harmful to real progress. Vance's response was measured but powerful. "Let me share something with you, Thomas. Last month, I spent time with Jesse Thomas and Madison Spears, community organizers in my hometown. They showed me how local solutions, when properly supported, can create real change. It's not about bootstraps, it's about building ladders and supporting each other as we climb." The studio audience, including skeptics like Sylvia Welch and Melanie Ewing, found themselves reconsidering their preconceptions. This wasn't the defensive posturing they had expected, but rather a thoughtful exploration of complex issues grounded in real experience. As the tension mounted, Manning attempted to corner Vance on his political evolution. "Your critics, including Gail Jackson and Stephen Lewis, point out apparent contradictions in your positions over the years. How do you explain these inconsistencies?" Vance's response would become another viral moment. "You know what's interesting about growth, Thomas? It's that we often mistake it for inconsistency. When Vincent Dean started teaching in my old high school, he probably had different views than he does now after 20 years of experience. Would you call that hypocrisy, or would you call it learning?" The analogy landed with surprising force. In the audience, Eduardo Cooper and Kendra Suarez nodded in recognition. They had seen this dynamic play out in their own communities, where real-world experience often challenged theoretical perspectives. Manning, visibly struggling to maintain his usual dominance, turned to his final line of attack. Christopher Navarro and Jonathan Kim have written extensively about how stories like yours can actually reinforce harmful narratives about poverty and success. But Vance's response would demonstrate why authentic understanding trumps academic criticism. "You know, I recently sat down with Timothy Stone and John Collins, who run a community center in my old neighborhood. They shared something profound about how national narratives often miss local realities. Would you like to hear what they taught me?" The invitation to engage with real experience rather than theoretical debate left Manning momentarily speechless. Catherine Barnes, watching from the audience, couldn't help but smile at how the tables had turned. As the second segment drew to a close, Vance delivered another memorable line. "The question isn't whether success stories can be harmful, it's whether we're using our success to build bridges back to the communities we came from. And that's something I do every single day." The production team, led by Derek McDonald and Cynthia Thomas, scrambled to adjust their approach for the final segment. This wasn't the confrontational spectacle they had planned for, but rather something far more valuable, a genuine dialogue about complex social issues. In the brief break that followed, even Manning's strongest supporters like Daryl Mercado and Tom Hill had to admit that the interview had taken an unexpected turn. What was meant to be a public humiliation had instead become a powerful demonstration of how authentic experience can transcend political theater. The energy in the studio had transformed completely. What started as an attempt to discredit had become a masterclass in turning confrontation into conversation. As the cameras prepared to roll again, the question wasn't whether Vance would survive the interview, but rather how many more lessons in authentic leadership he would share before it was over. The third segment began with a palpable shift in the studio atmosphere. Brian Taylor, a veteran camera operator, noticed how the audience's body language had changed. They were no longer waiting for a takedown, but rather leaning in to catch every word of authentic dialogue. Even Manning's typically unwavering confidence showed signs of strain as he prepared his next line of questioning. "Let's address the elephant in the room," Manning began, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. "Critics like Jill Davidson and Travis Wright argue that your success story is essentially a fairy tale, carefully crafted to appeal to a certain demographic. Joseph White, a prominent sociologist, suggests your narrative oversimplifies complex social issues." Vance's response would become one of the most shared clips of the year. "You know, Thomas, I find it interesting that we often dismiss lived experience in favor of theoretical analysis. Just last week, I sat down with Sean Heath and Janice Carpenter, who run a community outreach program. They shared something profound about the gap between academic understanding and real-world challenges." The studio fell silent as Vance continued, his voice carrying the weight of authentic experience. "Jill Horn and Christy Robertson, who work with struggling families every day, understand something that often gets lost in these theoretical debates, that real change happens through direct engagement, not distant analysis." Manning, attempting to regain control, turned to more personal attacks. Kenneth Martinez and Taylor Moore have written extensively about how stories like yours can actually harm community progress by promoting individualistic solutions to systemic problems. But Vance's response demonstrated why genuine understanding trumps academic criticism. "Let me share something interesting about that perspective," he began, drawing on a recent experience. "Wendy Manning and Karen Warren, who work in community development, showed me how individual success stories and systemic change aren't mutually exclusive, they're actually complementary forces for progress." The audience, including Julie Dixon and Anthony Young, found themselves nodding in agreement. This wasn't the defensive posturing they had expected, but rather a thoughtful exploration of complex social realities. Manning's frustration became increasingly evident as he shuffled through his notes. Joyce Love and Nicole Terrell suggest that your perspective lacks nuance, that you're essentially promoting a simplified narrative that ignores broader societal factors. Vance's calm response would become another viral moment. "You know what's fascinating about that criticism?" he began, his voice measured and thoughtful. "When I spoke with Jake Knight and Kimberly Delgado last month about their community work, they shared something powerful about how personal responsibility and systemic change can work together. Would you like to hear what they taught me?" The invitation to engage with real-world experience rather than theoretical debate left Manning momentarily flustered. William Young and Brian Moreno, seasoned journalists in the audience, exchanged knowing glances. They were witnessing a masterclass in turning hostile questioning into meaningful dialogue. As Manning struggled to maintain his usual dominance, Norman Jones and Tony Green watched from the audience as the power dynamic continued to shift. What was meant to be an ambush had transformed into a demonstration of authentic leadership. "Your critics, including Kylie Hicks and Adam Mercado, suggest that you've essentially abandoned your roots for personal gain," Manning pressed, his voice carrying a note of desperation. Vance's response would illuminate why genuine connection transcends social criticism. "You know, I recently visited my old neighborhood with Deborah Hill and Emily Kerr. We spent time with families facing the same challenges I once did. The conversation we had about real solutions versus theoretical approaches was eye-opening. Would you like to hear what we learned?" The studio audience, including Ray Foster and Felicia Clark, sat captivated as Vance continued to transform confrontational questions into opportunities for meaningful discussion. Mrs. Melissa Johnson and Rebecca Sanford, both community activists, found themselves reconsidering their initial skepticism. Manning, visibly struggling, turned to his final line of attack for the segment. Andrea White and Rebecca Pugh argue that your success story creates unrealistic expectations for others facing similar challenges. But Vance's response would demonstrate why authentic experience carries more weight than theoretical criticism. "Let me share something interesting about expectations," he began, drawing on recent conversations. Christian Spence and Samantha Benson, who work with youth in struggling communities, taught me something profound about the difference between inspiration and false hope. The studio lights seemed to grow warmer as Vance connected each criticism to real-world experience. Felicia Brown and Brittany Bartlett, seated in the front row, couldn't help but admire how he transformed every attack into an opportunity for deeper understanding. As the segment progressed, Manning's attempts to discredit Vance only served to highlight the authenticity of his perspective. Heather Brooks and Stephanie King watched as each theoretical criticism was met with practical wisdom grounded in real experience. "Your critics, including Shannon Morris and George Jackson, suggest that your narrative oversimplifies the path to success," Manning attempted, his voice losing its earlier confidence. Vance's response would become another memorable moment. "You know what's interesting about simplification? When I spoke with William Cooper and Tamara Lee about their work in education, they shared something fascinating about how we often mistake clarity for oversimplification. Would you like to hear their perspective?" The audience, including Jordan Chong and Laura Ruiz, sat mesmerized as Vance continued to demonstrate how authentic understanding transcends academic criticism. Maria Hale and Bonnie Lloyd, both educators, found themselves taking notes on his approach to difficult conversations. As the third segment drew to a close, Manning made one final attempt to regain control. Stacy Beard and Jennifer Ramirez suggest that your success story is more about luck than systemic change. But Vance's response would perfectly encapsulate why genuine experience trumps theoretical analysis. You know, I recently spent time with Mrs. Alexis Morales and Cherry, who run a community support program. They shared something profound about how individual success and systemic change are actually two sides of the same coin. The production team, led by Carol Garcia and Wendy Turner, watched in amazement as their planned takedown continued to transform into something far more valuable, a masterclass in authentic dialogue and leadership. Matthew Peters and Sharon Benjamin, veteran media analysts in the audience, recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented. What was intended to be a moment of public humiliation had become a powerful demonstration of how genuine understanding can transform hostile questioning into meaningful conversation. As the segment ended, Megan Henderson and Dennis Peck exchanged glances that seemed to say what everyone was thinking. This interview had become something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. Deanna Fitzpatrick and Lynn Knight, both community advocates, found themselves reconsidering their own approaches to difficult conversations. The tension in the studio had transformed into something else entirely, a shared recognition that authentic experience, when properly articulated, carries more weight than any theoretical criticism. Sierra Alexander and Matthew Aguirre, watching from the audience, couldn't help but feel they were witnessing a pivotal moment in public discourse. As the cameras prepared for the final segment, Michael Graves and Douglas Barron discussed how this interview would likely be studied in journalism classes for years to come. What started as an attempt at public humiliation had become a masterclass in turning confrontation into conversation. Dawn Wilson and Christine Warren watched as the production team scrambled to adjust their approach for the final segment. The question was no longer whether Vance would survive the interview, but rather how many more lessons in authentic leadership he would share before it was over. The final segment began with an almost tangible shift in the studio's energy. Sharon Chavez and Mitchell Connor, both veteran television producers, could sense they were witnessing the conclusion of something remarkable. Manning, his usual confidence notably diminished, prepared for one last attempt to regain control of the narrative that had so completely slipped from his grasp. "Let's address your recent comments about community development," Manning began, his voice carrying a hint of resignation. "Chad Johnson and Noah Gibson suggest your approach ignores fundamental systemic barriers. Christopher Parsons and Melissa Strong argue that your success story actually perpetuates harmful myths about social mobility." Vance's response would become the most quoted moment of the entire interview. "You know what's fascinating about that perspective?" he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of lived experience. "Just last week, I sat down with Aaron Rodriguez and Mr. Brian Hinton DDS, who've spent decades working in community development. They shared something profound about the false dichotomy between individual success and systemic change." The studio audience, including Dustin Ramirez and Catherine Coleman, sat captivated as Vance continued to transform hostile questioning into meaningful dialogue. John Yates and Catherine Jones watched as each theoretical criticism was met with practical wisdom grounded in real experience. Manning, making one final attempt to assert his narrative, pressed forward. Darren Medina and Bryce Wilson argue that your story oversimplifies the complexities of poverty and social mobility. Mark Hudson and James Lara suggest you're essentially promoting a bootstrap mentality. But Vance's response would demonstrate why authentic understanding transcends academic criticism. "Let me share something interesting about that," he began, drawing on recent experiences. "When I visited my old neighborhood with Robert Lopez and Justin Boyle, we spoke with families facing the same challenges I once did. Their insights about the relationship between personal responsibility and systemic support were eye-opening." Angela Brown and Stacey Berry, community activists in the audience, found themselves nodding in agreement. This wasn't the defensive posturing they had expected, but rather a thoughtful exploration of complex social realities. As Manning's frustration became increasingly evident, John Jordan and Teresa Romero watched the power dynamic continue to shift. What was meant to be an ambush had transformed into a demonstration of authentic leadership that would be studied for years to come. Your critics, including John Montgomery and Michelle Schmidt, suggest that your narrative lacks nuance. Manning attempted, his voice losing its earlier edge. Vance's response would illuminate why genuine connection transcends social criticism. You know what I find interesting about nuance? He began, his voice measured and thoughtful. Ivan Donaldson and Don Coleman recently showed me something fascinating about how real-world solutions often require both personal initiative and community support. Would you like to hear what they taught me? The studio audience, including Adam McCormick and Lee Sanchez, sat mesmerized as Vance continued to demonstrate how authentic understanding transforms confrontational questions into opportunities for meaningful discussion. Jonathan Brady and Keith Morris found themselves taking notes on his approach to difficult conversations. Manning, visibly struggling to maintain his composure, made one last attempt. Kayla McCormick and Michelle Fox suggest that your success story creates unrealistic expectations for others facing similar challenges. But Vance's response would perfectly encapsulate why genuine experience carries more weight than theoretical analysis. Let me share something powerful about expectations, he began, drawing on recent conversations. Jessica Brown and Dr. Sarah Martinez taught me something profound about the difference between inspiration and false hope. It's not about creating unrealistic expectations, it's about showing what's possible while acknowledging the support systems needed to make it happen. The production team, led by Catherine Brooks and Jamie Trevino, watched in amazement as their planned takedown continued to transform into something far more valuable, a masterclass in authentic dialogue and leadership. As the final moments approached, Manning made one last attempt to challenge Vance's credibility. Jacob Joyce and Adam Santiago suggest that your perspective oversimplifies complex social issues. Vance's response would become the interview's defining moment. You know what's fascinating about simplification? He began, his voice carrying the weight of authentic experience. When I spoke with Norma Arnold and Megan Turner about their work in community development, they shared something profound about how we often mistake clarity for oversimplification. The real question isn't whether success stories can be harmful, it's whether we're using our platforms to build bridges and create real opportunities for others. The studio fell silent as Vance continued. Melissa Mercado and Megan Hall, both community advocates, exchanged glances that seemed to say what everyone was thinking. They were witnessing something unprecedented in public discourse. Manning, his usual arsenal of gotcha questions exhausted, sat back as Vance delivered his final thoughts. You know, Christine Thomas and Robert Schmidt recently showed me something powerful about how authentic dialogue can bridge the gap between theoretical understanding and practical solutions. It's not about proving who's right, it's about finding what works. The audience, including Melinda Wolf and Philip Chin, sat captivated as Vance transformed what was meant to be a moment of humiliation into a powerful demonstration of authentic leadership. Joseph Edwards and Christine Glenn watched as each attempt at confrontation was met with wisdom and grace. As the interview drew to a close, Benjamin Murray and Cody Coleman recognized that they had witnessed something remarkable, a complete reversal of the expected power dynamic through the quiet strength of authentic experience. Manning, his usual confidence completely deflated, could only watch as Vance delivered his closing thoughts. The greatest challenge we face isn't about individual success versus systemic change, Vance began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived the reality he discussed. As Natasha Jordan and Robert Steele recently showed me through their community work, it's about how we can combine both approaches to create real, lasting change. The production team, including Chase Chin and Jacob Wilson PhD, scrambled to capture every moment of what had become an unexpected masterclass in turning confrontation into conversation. Carla DeLeon and Austin Walker, veteran media analysts, knew they were witnessing something that would be studied and discussed for years to come. In the final moments, Manning attempted one last challenge. Amanda Kelly and Jeffrey Coleman suggest that your success story is more about luck than systemic change. But Vance's response would become the perfect conclusion to the interview. You know what's interesting about luck? He began, drawing on his experiences. When I spoke with Daniel Howell and Jeffrey Jordan about their work in community development, they shared something profound about how opportunity and preparation intersect. It's not about luck versus systems, it's about how we can create more opportunities while helping people prepare to seize them. The studio audience, including Michael Wilcox and Elizabeth Martinez, sat in respectful silence as Vance delivered his final thoughts. The real question isn't whether success stories like mine are helpful or harmful, he concluded. It's how we can use these stories to build bridges, create opportunities, and support others in their own journeys. As the cameras prepared to stop rolling, John Rivas and Carla Flores understood that they had witnessed something far more significant than a typical television interview. What was meant to be a public humiliation had become a powerful demonstration of how authentic experience and wisdom can transform hostile questioning into meaningful dialogue. The production team, led by Bradley Roth and James Francis, knew they would need to completely reimagine how they would present this interview. Rather than the expected takedown, they had captured a masterclass in authentic leadership and meaningful conversation. Linda Williams and Jenny Santiago watched as Manning, his usual bravado completely dissipated, could only nod in acknowledgement of what had transpired. Daniel Robinson and Lisa Salas recognized that they had witnessed a pivotal moment in public discourse, one where authentic experience had triumphed over attempted humiliation. As the studio lights dimmed, Marissa Chandler and Mark Barnes discussed how this interview would likely become a case study in effective communication and authentic leadership. What started as an attempt to discredit had become a powerful demonstration of how genuine understanding can transform confrontation into conversation. The final moments captured something unexpected, a complete reversal of the intended narrative through the quiet strength of authentic experience and wisdom. As the audience filed out, many, including Kenneth Powers and Christy Sullivan, found themselves reconsidering their own approaches to difficult conversations and complex social issues. What was meant to be a moment of public humiliation had instead become a powerful reminder that authentic experience, when properly articulated, carries more weight than any attempted takedown. The lesson was clear: true authority comes not from the ability to humiliate, but from the wisdom to transform confrontation into meaningful dialogue. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and share your thoughts on this remarkable demonstration of authentic leadership in the face of attempted public humiliation. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories of wisdom triumphing over confrontation.